Lights are bright. Thanks very much for that introduction, and thanks for inviting me to speak here today. This is a great opportunity, and I'm really excited to do this. Was excited to put the material together. This is a unique conference, as you saw from my bio. Agriculture has been and is my life. Primary agriculture, a big part of that. Just to give you some context as far as how much of a Southern Ontario guy I am, my wife and I farm on the 401 basically between Toronto and Kingston. We have land, so we have crops right up literally to Lake Ontario. So we're about as far south as it gets relative to here. And I think one of the things with all of the work that I've done in Northern Ontario over the years, and I've done a fair bit of it, ministry staff, industry, farmers, that kind of thing, all across the north, right through to sort of the farther north in terms of Hearst, et cetera, is that, this is, again, a very unique thing. We don't see a regional type meeting for agriculture anywhere really in Ontario to this extent, so congratulations. And again, I think that's one of the reasons why I was so excited and come and talk about how agriculture is changing in Northern Ontario, talk about some of the opportunities, the challenges, and also help reiterate for you how important Northern Ontario agriculture and agri-food is to the rest of the province, and it's something you should be proud of and promote. So as mentioned, I'm an economist, and so that's my primary role with the ministry. I'm responsible for economic analysis and statistics. We have a pretty good team of people across Ontario working on this stuff. We do a lot of things in Ontario around economic impact, et cetera, that really isn't available in most other provinces, and this is an example of that. And so this is kind of a summary of we produce, and this is, again, everything I'm going to talk about today is publicly available on our ministry statistics site at ontario.ca. So this is all public info, and for the most part, you'll have the URL at the bottom on most of the slides, so you can go directly to that if you want. And all of this information would be available for any jurisdiction in Ontario, any region, any county or district, any municipality or township. And so one of the main sources of information we use is the Census of Agriculture. I know there's oftentimes some discussion about it, is it the best measure, et cetera, but it is a significant piece of statistical information for Canadian agriculture and for Ontario. And so in 2021, there was roughly 1,782 farms across Northern Ontario, and our estimates are they generated $238 million in farm cash receipts. That's farm sales of agricultural products off the operation, grains and oilseeds, dairy, cattle, representing those top three. And we're going to go into a little bit of the profile of what is produced in Northern Ontario across that gamut. We're often asked across the industry, well, we produce this product, what is the economic impact? Who does it affect? Who does it benefit? And it's become a common thing in government in particular. We ask that of industry, you want funding for a project, what might be the benefits, and economic impact tends to be a driver in that regard. So that $238 million generated about $522 million in GDP, gross domestic product. It's a measure of value add, a measure of production all across Ontario, recognizing that we're part of a broader agri-food system as the province consists, supporting over 7,800 jobs in the agri-food sector from farm to fork all across Ontario. So that's significant. It's a big piece of the puzzle, and we do this for every community because it helps articulate what that farm level production means in feeding Ontarians, creating jobs, creating economic opportunity, creating exports, et cetera. And within those 1,782 farms in Northern Ontario, there were 2,500 farm operators. So people, for example, like my wife and I, who are a farm partnership, so we would be two farm partners and to give you an example in that context, actively farming around 450,000 acres in total farm area. We'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. Within the community, agri-food sector, within the community specifically, jobs tied to agri-food within Northern Ontario, just almost 28,000 through around 3,900 local farm businesses and agri-food businesses. So it's a broad, fairly significant thing. And then I know the North, and from a regional point of view, has a number of districts. Every district is distinct. We see that more so in other parts, Eastern Ontario, for example. Certain regions like Northumberland, for example, where I farm and grew up, is quite a bit different than, say, Frontenac County, Leeds, Grenville, that kind of thing. So we tried to break it down here Temiskaming being the largest area, obviously from a production point of view, but every area is significant and has significant contribution to the broader Ontario economy. And again, it's something to recognize and to acknowledge. But how is the profile of the sector changing? So again, we've got a farm all the way to fork, the agri-food sector. That's how we as a province look at it. You'll hear our minister talk about that quite a bit. Again, the various pieces of that puzzle, where do we all fit in? And in a room like this today, there's people from all parts of that. And I think that's why that's a very unique conference to participate in. But at the farm level, just like across the rest of the province, we've seen in Northern Ontario declining farm numbers and declining total farm area. So that's land that is actively used by a farm. That means that that piece of land has somebody using it that's filing income tax as a farm. That doesn't necessarily mean that the land is no longer able to be farmed, which is an important context depending on where you live in the province. And I'll come back to that in a second. But what we have seen is that the number of farms and the total farm area in Northern Ontario has fallen more rapidly than it has in the rest of Ontario. And I'm going to go over some nuance in that regard. But one of the key measures that we look at as a ministry in this context is a term called land and crops. And you're going to hear me talk about that more as we go through. Land and crops basically means for any particular farm, that's the land that's in grain and oilseed production, horticultural production, hay, as opposed to land that might be woodlands, wetlands, etc. So if you take our farm, for example, we grow about 1,000 acres of corn, soybeans, and wheat. And again, in Northumberland County, we have probably about 50 acres of rough land that we would consider woodland. In our Northumberland farm, we have about 200 acres of pasture, and we also have a farm south of Tobermory with about 300 acres where we pasture cattle as well. And so those would sort of tie into that idea of land and crops. I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. So one of the things that is interesting is that we all drive around communities. The farm community, in my experience, is very observant about what's going on in its community, very interested. And bringing land back into production, new producers, etc., is something that's of great interest. There was mentioned Mennonites here earlier, and that's been a major growing part of many parts of Ontario, not just northern, the Matheson area as an example. North of where our farm is, not too far from where I grew up, a place called Sterling, Ontario, which is kind of north of Belleville. There's been a lot of Mennonites move into that particular area, Amish as well, and so they're moving into different parts of Ontario, taking advantage of available land, lower valued land, etc. One of the things we don't have a great handle on is how that land transitions, and in particular how land is brought back into production if it hasn't been sitting in production for a while. And this is a number in the census that we called land prepared for seeding. And it's an interesting number because you can see the distinction in many areas, such as the Matheson area, where there has been increases in land where even though maybe the total farm area is falling, usually because there's been some farms getting out of production, etc., but you can see that there's been increased, I'm just going to see if, I do have that's a big one. You can see basically where there's been an increase, and it doesn't move all that quick, sorry, but you can see where there's been this increase, and that's about 19% or 30,000 acres in the north. That, generally speaking, is land that's being converted into productive land that was sitting idle previously. And that's one of the unique things about the agricultural census and the concept of total farm area. It isn't all the land that's available. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, but it's land that is actively farmed. And this is a large number relative to across Ontario. Take our farm, for example. We've owned it since 2006, and we've been gradually expanding the farm, not just in terms of purchasing or renting more land, but we've been taking out fence bottoms, cleaning up rough land, turning some pasture into productive cropland, tile draining, that kind of thing, but not to this extent. So again, there's some busyness here. It's a good thing that we've got a large screen. I had a feeling we would have one, which is why I tempered some of the numbers the way they are. Again, this is all available publicly, but one of the things I think that's really interesting about the North is the significant variety of production despite some of the inherent challenges related to weather and a number of other things, infrastructure, transport, those types of stuff. The inherent challenges that we hear a lot about relative to Northern Ontario. And how, in particular, things like greenhouse, floriculture, right? How those things have grown, field vegetables, potatoes, all of which are not necessarily completely traditional crops, and how that's changed and improved, and is a reflection of a number of things, including producers taking advantage of opportunity, seeing market opportunities, which we'll come to later. Groups like this where you're sharing information about that, talking about, for example, the presentation later today on hops and malting barley, seeing market opportunities and taking advantage of it. It is a different context, I think, than in Southern Ontario. In Southern Ontario, you know, as a producer, a lot of our farm was once apple orchard, for example. We're growing corn, soybeans, and wheat on it. The choices, while potentially large for us in terms of what we might choose to do, you know, you're very much in a commodity world, and I think the thinking around that as a producer is different. So I think that's a really big and significant thing. But again, in any region of the province, and importantly in the north, what's the support available for various parts of the sector? So what's the support available for primary ag within Northern Ontario? And I think there's going to be a presentation later today on the vet access project that was referenced earlier as a major project, and we see that from an infrastructure point of view in many parts of Ontario where veterinary access in terms of agronomists. I know we did some work in Kapuskasing a number of years ago prior to COVID, and being able to get insights from people like me, for example, that kind of have a host of experience in agriculture is a lot more limited because agriculture isn't maybe as expansive as it is in Southern Ontario. But even in Southern Ontario, as an example, there's fewer and fewer opportunities for equipment dealers, that kind of stuff. It's far more spread out. If I want to get a piece of equipment fixed, it's a much bigger thing than it used to be. And so this, I think, will continue to be a major issue, and I think that's one of the key things that the industry and government need to keep working on, is building the infrastructure to support the sector. In terms of food manufacturing, again, this is an interesting thing from the broader Ontario context because we are Canada's largest food manufacturing province, largely because of our population, but also supported by major production. We export a lot of product internationally and across Canada. Northern Ontario is an important part of that. Businesses have been growing. You can see on the left-hand side, food manufacturing specifically in some areas has declined in terms of the number of businesses, but overall in Northern Ontario, it's expanded. And again, this is important from an infrastructure point of view to build capacity for primary production, for distribution and networking. Beverage and tobacco manufacturing is an interesting one because in Northern Ontario, it's actually grown more than in the rest of Ontario, at least on a percentage basis. COVID was a real struggle in the beverage industry in particular. The dairy industry, as an example, as somebody who grew up on a dairy farm, spent a lot of time through my career working on dairy. The management of fluid milk during the period of COVID was challenging because of the closure of restaurants, et cetera, as well as in terms of things like Coca-Cola or soft drinks or different types of drinks. There was a lot of challenges through COVID that made adjustments, but in Northern Ontario, we've seen an increase in those businesses. And again, I think that's a reflection of the cost of transport of liquid-based products, bulky, and some of the initiatives, I think, where people are supporting more local production, again, from a beverage point of view. And we see that in certain parts of the province more and more. And again, I think continuing to be a big opportunity for the overall sector. The other side of it being wholesale distribution. This is a really big one in many sectors. Again, if you're a grain and oilseed producer in Southern Ontario and you're like me, you're growing corn, soybeans, and wheat, unloading that product, I have endless numbers of places I can deliver the product if I want. I know the price, I can deliver it on the spot effectively. That isn't necessarily the case with a lot of other commodities, horticulture in particular. It's not the same necessarily in other parts of the province as well. And what we've seen in the north is a fairly big expansion in the number of farm product merchant wholesalers. So people buying direct from farmers, wholesaling that, whether that's down to the food terminal in Toronto or whether that's into local markets, institutions, et cetera. And that's another really big avenue. In horticulture in particular, we've seen very much a sort of a movement where you have very large-scale producers who are dealing directly with the retail chains, et cetera, or smaller producers that are largely focusing on direct-to-consumer, adding value, taking a retail dollar as opposed to a farm or a wholesale dollar. On the food and beverage side, we've seen a little bit of the reversal, but again, in the beverage and tobacco side of things, a lot of times manufacturers have their own distribution, so that's one of the challenges in that context. The food and retail sector, servicing the public, again, in every community in Ontario is significant. Some communities have a greater presence from a tourism point of view. So if you take Prince Edward County, for example, they estimate that in any given summer, 200,000 people come into the community and use grocery stores, restaurants, and the like, and support primary agriculture as well through farmers markets and that kind of stuff. What we've seen in Northern Ontario, like other parts of the province, is that COVID was a real challenge. The closure of food and service businesses at varying points through COVID resulted in a reduction in the number of businesses. In addition, again, I think this is something to think about in terms of thinking forward as far as growing demand, which I'll talk a little bit about that in a sec. You know, you do have in Northern Ontario slightly slower population growth at 2.5%. Than the rest of the province, and again, income growth roughly the same, but those two factors are quite significant in terms of growth in these two areas. And if you look at when we talk as a ministry, for example, you're a minister, talk about the number of jobs in Ontario supported by the agri-food sector, over 870,000. Quite frankly, the largest group of them across Ontario, no matter where you are these two groups: grocery stores, beverage stores, food and service drinking places. And over the last 25 years, those have been the two main groups where job numbers have been going up. Those are not industries that are as focused on labor productivity as farms or food processors, right? The farm industry is fully productivity based, which means you're necessarily going to have fewer people employed as time goes by. That's a reality. Food manufacturing, quite similar. So what is the profile of jobs in agri-food within the community? We kind of talk in economic terms about how much farming here in the north creates across Ontario. How much is it? You know, for example, the gentleman talked about no, it's not ag, but it's a plastic initiative in Brighton, Ontario. Well, I farm just west of Brighton, so as an example. So, you know, there's an interaction in all of these parts of the economy. What are the jobs within the area? And by my math, the overall agri-food sector would be the second largest employment group in the north, behind healthcare and social assistance. So again, you know, you can make different distinctions in terms of categories, but the bottom line is it's a significant employer with, you know, almost 28,000 people employed within the agri-food sector in Northern Ontario. We call that daytime employment. Basically, you work in the community. Again, in the Southern Ontario context or in some of these other areas, that's an important characteristic, because there'll be people that work in a particular industry that are driving in from an extended distance to work in that. So again, if you go across the bottom, around 3,000 in the primary ag side of things, 900 in the food and beverage manufacturing, 60 in ag supply, so farm input supply effectively, and then 10,500 in food stores and 12,700 in restaurants, et cetera. So again, quite a profile of employment, a changing profile, but a big part. Obviously, food prices, a big issue all across, the world for right now, but in Canada, continuing to see some fairly strong food inflation, although inflation has come down. This is some data that we get from a custom run from Stats Canada, looking at the broader context of Northern Ontario for specific products. So this doesn't line up with the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, perfectly, but it gives you a pretty good tell. And what I tried to do here is give some comparison to Toronto, because that's the other reference point we have just as a base, and expressing the price for certain things in Northern Ontario relative to Toronto on the right-hand side of this table. So if you go all the way back over to 2019 on the far right, I tried to do December over a period of time. In December of 2019, for all food products rolled together, Northern Ontario food prices were about 102.2% of Toronto, so 2.2% higher. Now again, that varies. As you go down the list, you can see that some meat products were lower at that point in time, and others were quite a bit higher. If you go to 2020, so right into COVID, some differences again. If you go 2021, similar differences in 2022, and then this most recent data in December of 2023, some much larger differences, in particular, a lot of that being, if you dig into it deeper, into things like canned products, et cetera, bulkier to transport, higher net weight values, that kind of thing. So again, this isn't necessarily a new concept to anybody that lives in Northern Ontario or me as somebody that's been working in the field for a long time. The challenge, I guess, is collectively how do you have an impact on that? And local food or local food production can contribute to improving access to food. In some cases, it can help lower food prices. In some cases, it can reduce transportation costs. It isn't necessarily a fix-all for food prices. And again, depending on where you are in the province, it can contribute more or less. But again, this is a major impetus from the perspective of local producers in trying to find a market to compete with more expensive products that are largely expensive because of the transportation costs to get them there. So, food production in Northern Ontario. One of the things that is the most complicated that we deal with as a ministry is this idea of how much food do we consume. We really don't have a measure of that in this country. We have it at a national level of specific products. StatsCan does that, but we don't really have a good provincial measure. It's a really complicated thing, and a lot of that has to do with the very personal and private sort of transaction of consuming food that we all individually do, right? It's a very complicated thing, and to measure it perfectly is challenging. But we as a ministry put statistics together. They're available on what we call our county or district profiles, so you can get this information for everywhere in Ontario, right down to the municipal level. But I've got the districts in Northern Ontario here. And what we've basically done is we went in and estimated, based on per capita consumption numbers, what we think Northern Ontario would consume of fruits, vegetables, grain products, meat, poultry, eggs, and dairy, based on population and per capita numbers, and compared that to what is produced of those products here in Northern Ontario. Now, the focus here is not on everything. So, for example, bananas, oranges are not included in this. Fruit are things that we can grow in Ontario. So we'll focus on the stuff that we can grow here. And so again, recognizing that, what we've seen is, again, from 2016 to 2021, in aggregate, we haven't went up a whole lot, but we have went up a fair bit in certain categories, in certain areas. In certain areas, we produce more than is required, grain in particular. The calculation of trying to figure out how much wheat and flour, et cetera, would be consumed is a little bit of a math formula, but the gist is that we're producing in certain areas of this region significantly more than we need, which means we're moving that product to elsewhere. And what I think the key thing here is showing opportunity. So we use this information in parts of Ontario to help understand where there might be opportunities to grow more specific things. And if you go into the URL that's provided here, you get into how much asparagus, for example, would be consumed here, to give you one specific product, to see how much is grown versus how much might be consumed and how many more acres could fill that local market. And we've seen a fair number of communities, Prince Edward County, Rideau Lakes as an example, have used that information to help build promotional campaigns in summer months when product is in-house. So this is an important thing from trying to understand. And again, the North is a very significant producer of food, despite, I guess, the rap that it gets or sometimes gives itself, in my experience. So the other thing I think that's very unique to understand is about the distribution of food products from the farm to consumers. And this is also something measured by the census, but about 32% of Northern Ontario farms sell some portion of their farm products direct to consumers. That's double the provincial level. Now again, this can be a bit of a wide definition. It could be somebody like me that sells direct consumer beef, or it could be somebody that has on-farm markets, et cetera, but it's much larger than elsewhere in Ontario. And that's important, I think, because it is a tell on this idea of this integrated local food economy. And again, one of the reasons why you have a conference like this and we don't have in Eastern Ontario, for example. 55% of the farms that sell direct to consumer generate 50% or more of their sales from this market channel. Now again, they may not be full-time farms, it may not be their sole source of income, but this is the bulk of their income, and that's significant. Because direct-to-consumer sales, generally speaking, is taking a retail dollar. A lot of times is taking a larger volume of product and certain commodities, and as well as creating a different relationship with the consumer and is keeping the product local. And I think that's really important. And in the context of today's discussion, that's significant. Roughly 16% of those selling direct-to-consumer are doing value add, so that's some form of processing, et cetera. And again, there's more and more on-farm processing going on all the time. Almost 80% of the farms in Northern Ontario that sell some portion of their farm product direct do through on-farm facilities. This is important in that it's, again, a more challenging thing to have on-farm sales than it is to do, for example, we sell about 50 cattle a year direct to consumer for beef, and I deliver every single, pound of beef we sell. So we don't have an on-farm store, whether it's at our house in Guelph or our farm in Northumberland. To have some kind of on-farm facility, again, for a product like that changes the nature of how you sell and interact with the consumer quite a bit. So that's significant. 18% of the farms that sell direct to consumer do through public farm markets. That's a lot higher than the rest of Ontario. Public farm markets are a significant thing all across Ontario. But again, in the south, it's not something as many producers rely on as a source for their marketing of their products. So it again speaks to the infrastructure both available and required here in Northern Ontario and how it's significant and important. The other thing I did was basically look at the cost structure of Northern Ontario farms. Now again, this is a challenging thing, and as somebody that ran farm programs for a long time and has done a lot of farm accounting, really you have to look at an individual farm to truly understand their costs. However, there are some things you can take from aggregate data, and what this basically does is it calculates out two things: sales per acre of land and crops in Northern Ontario for different farm types, and then the operating costs for those same farms per acre of the land and crops on their farm. So if you look at, we'll take the all farms group, for example. If you go across there, in Ontario for the whole province, the average acre for land and crops in Ontario generates around $2,200 an acre in farm sales, and it's about $703 in the north. That's not surprising given the nature of production, the difference in commodities, et cetera. But then when you compare the operating costs, it's $1,800 across Ontario and $621. And one of the things that was interesting to me is again that those Northern Ontario operating costs per acre are proportionately lower, which again is, I think one of the things that we get caught up in the sector oftentimes is, if you're a small producer, you're inefficient. That tends to be a generalization that's made about the sector, or if you're smaller. But again, the north being smaller on average is still how to focus from the data, and you can go into it in more detail in terms of efficiency. And again, I think that's important because it's a reflection of the infrastructure that's there in terms of the sector. So land values and rental rates. This is all, again, on our ministry statistics site. For those of you that are OFA, NFU, or CFFO members, which I guess is technically all the three major farm groups in Ontario, you might have received the farmland rental survey that Brady Deaton at the University of Guelph does recently, which also supplements this information. But Northern Ontario farm values grew about 66% between 2016 and 21. Rental rates about 18%. But again, being at a much lower level, $3,000 per acre on average, again in this data set versus over $14,000 at the provincial level all across Ontario. So again, lower values, sometimes reflecting differences in productivity, sometimes reflecting distance. There's a bunch of different things. Our farmland on the shore of Lake Ontario is worth a lot more than the agricultural value of that land, even though it's zoned prime ag. So, it's all relative, but it does speak to some of the things that we're talking about here at this conference, and I'm going to talk about here in a second. So how have things been changing as far as production goes? Well, in terms of yields, corn silage in Northern Ontario hasn't really improved at the same rate as it has in Southern Ontario, which is interesting to me, knowing how much more corn is produced farther north. So again, if you go, for example, where the one property we have just south of Tobermory, basically, where we pasture some cattle, there's corn growing up there that's as good as the corn we grow in Northumberland. And 20 years ago, there wasn't any corn grown there when we first started going up there. It was canola at most. And now it's highly productive. There's some grain elevators. And this isn't just a function of people moving in. It's a function of a variety of things, which I'm going to talk about in a bit. On the hay side, interestingly enough, all across Ontario, yields have been flat. That includes Northern Ontario. Hay's a little complicated because the hayland changes so much. We're losing some of the best hayland, and we're maintaining what would probably be not as solid land, again, depending where you are. So that's important because those are two of the major forages we use in Northern Ontario. However, you contrast that with canola and barley, which again are major commodities in Northern Ontario, but major commodities across Ontario overall. And basically, Northern Ontario has outpaced the rest of Ontario in that context. Now, some of that I think is due to these two commodities being a largely northern type based production, drawing inputs from Western Canada in particular. But this is important from the idea that we've been able to gradually and significantly improve productivity despite some of these other challenges. And again, I'm going to come back to this point in a second. So what does it mean from a changing crop point of view? So one of the things I wanted to look at was crop insurance, production insurance participation in Northern Ontario, both in terms of how many people and acres are enrolled, and also what are the commodities that have been enrolled. And so this provides for 2016 and 2022 the number of acres that are enrolled by district in Northern Ontario. So just under 140,000 acres enrolled in 2016 and 166,000 in 2022. So a pretty significant increase, certainly relative to the rest of Ontario. That's a big increase from a percentage point of view. And then on the right-hand side, the crops covered, and if it's in red, that means that nobody was producing that commodity in 2016, but they now are. Okay, they maybe did that in 2017. I don't know. I just did those two comparisons. And the interesting thing is you do see some fairly interesting changes. Algoma, Adzuki beans, black beans. If anybody's grown colored beans or edible beans, they're a different product to grow. It requires a different type of marketing than soybeans from a pricing, combining structure point of view. Winter wheat, again, that's a tell because it's, hopefully you're getting to a point where the product can overwinter. Strawberries in one area, winter wheat in others, potatoes. But the other thing is that there's a really diverse profile of production. And again, crop insurance is a mainstay. It's something that if you look at most grains and oilseed commodities in Ontario, it's provided the ability to forward contract and participate in opportunities to control price and improve your marketing. And so participation is important. And the fact that it's growing, we'd like to see more forage rainfall growth. That's a big one in grazing areas. But I think that's, again, a reflection of what's been changing. So one of the things I wanted to look at was how the climate is changing. Now, this is something that, on the shore of Lake Ontario, I can see it changing. It's changed a lot in the time we've farmed. It's changed everywhere in Ontario. And there's kind of an adage that people in the grain industry use about Southern Ontario and the U.S. Midwest, and that, Southern Ontario is more today like Ohio and Illinois was from a crop production point of view 30 years ago, and that sort of continues on. And in Ontario, if you look at the varieties we're growing, in particular for a lot of the major grains and oilseeds, we're benefiting from the technology that the U.S. Midwest states have had for a period of time, and that plays into, I think, one of the benefits we've had. I know, like in our case at our farm, the last few years have been, on paper, drought or very close to it, but production has been very strong and tolerance better than I think most people would have expected. What this graph shows basically is the historical amount of participation, average temperature, last and first frost for the districts in the north, or major points in the north, starting at Geraldton, Kapuskasing, Cochrane, Timmins, New Liskeard, Sudbury, Owen Sound, Woodstock, and Chatham. So I kind of want to go from the north to the south, recognizing that Owen Sound South is what we typically, from a Southern Ontario point of view, but also high-yielding point of view. And I was saying to Sarah up earlier that, in the work I do, we used to consider 200 bushels to the acre in Southern Ontario a really high corn yield, and it's almost normal now. And again, it's a function of a variety of things. So this graph taken from Climate Atlas Canada looks at what they're predicting the temperature, frost, et cetera, from 21 to 50 will be, and then 51 to 2080. And what it predicts is that Geraldton in 30 plus years will have a similar climate to Sudbury over the last 40. And that New Liskeard would be closer to Owen Sound over the last 40, and so on and so forth. But if you look at, for example, on in the middle area, 2021 to 2050, and you go to Cochrane as an example, you have about a 25-day increase in what they're predicting the number of frost-free days would be. Now, again, that's not without risk. It's not without challenge, which is why I talk about crop insurance and the importance of having some of those tools available. But it goes to this idea of things are changing, and how do we manage that? How do we work within it? Does it change what we can do, the opportunities before us? And when you tie in a number of these other issues, I think, again, it goes to understanding where we want to move with that. And so this comes to a concept of underutilized farmland. So this is a different concept depending where you are in Ontario. So this data set that we have, this is, again, is on our ministry statistics site. This compares the census data, which measures the land that is in farming today that's actively farmed, okay? So the land that somebody is using and is tied to the census and tied to being taxed as a farmer, versus MPAC, Municipal Property Assessment. And so the MPAC data, which we do a lot of work with, has a farmland classification. That farmland classification, however, doesn't go away if the land sits idle because I'm not farming it, okay? And again, there's nuance to this data, so it's a conceptual thing to then dig into more local data. But what we tend to see all across Ontario, not just in the north, is that there's a lot of land that was once farmed that is now not farmed, it's sitting idle and still has a farmland designation. Some of that land is in near urban areas, which means chances are it's next up for urbanization, transition, et cetera. And that's a common thing if you're on London, Toronto, Guelph, et cetera. But if you take Northumberland County, where our farm is, or go farther east, Madoc, if anybody knows Eastern Ontario, there's a ton of land that was once farmed up there that doesn't have any urban pressure. It's sitting idle. It's sitting idle because of past economic concerns, issues, transitions, and it has some productivity, but a different level of productivity, and that productivity is changing a bit as the weather changes. Now, you can't make rock more productive, you can't make swamp more productive, but there are reasons within that. In Northern Ontario, there's close to 1 million acres in that MPAC data set that is not actively farmed today. Now, it's varying states of productivity, right? Some of it was farmed actively before, some of it was not actively farmed but was on a farm, so it still comes into that equation, right? But this is all about understanding what the potential for that land is, what you might be able to do with it. It goes back to that idea of the prepared for seeding calculation I mentioned before, where we're trying to understand what land we're bringing into production. But this is a more unique concept than it is in Southern Ontario, because for the most part, that green bar, which is that difference, is that idle land, that land isn't under the same urbanization pressure that it is in the south. So that can create opportunity, but it doesn't mean there aren't challenges or constraints. We know there's a lot of those, and it isn't necessarily such that ag's going to be the best decision for that land, but it is a different decision, I think, or context than in the south. And so to wrap this up in terms of how we want to grow and how there's opportunity to grow, this ties the first slide to the last and the summary, which is that for every dollar of farm sales that we generate, every additional dollar of farm sales in Northern Ontario, it creates $2.14 of GDP across the province. So you're having a significant contribution to everywhere in Ontario, not just here, and that's significant. And how does that translate into a practical on-the-ground term? Well, each acre of land and crops in Northern Ontario generates about $1,500 in GDP across the province. So again, despite some of the rhetoric around the north isn't productive, isn't small, et cetera, that couldn't be any farther from the truth. And I think it's important to understand this context. And these numbers are not all that unsimilar than they are in the rest of Ontario. And in the rest of Ontario, certain areas are pretty much full, right? We're not getting more land in Huron County, and Huron County is pretty well at capacity. Stormont-Dundas, at capacity, right? So there are differences in how this can be contextualized. And again, I think, again, to wrap up, that this is an opportunity for Northern Ontario now and into the future, probably more so than in the lifetimes of the people sitting in this room, for sure, in my opinion, but it's still a very significant thing that hopefully more people in ag like us can come along and take advantage of that. So thanks. Hopefully there's some time for some questions. If not, I'll be around and be happy to chat about this throughout the day, and enjoy the rest of your day.